Hello and welcome to our closing session of Bruegel's Annual Meeting 2020. So I'm Guntram Wolf and I'm the director of Bruegel, and I'm very pleased and honored to welcome to this closing session Esther Duflo. Esther Duflo is a professor for development economics and poverty research at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, and she is, of course, also a Nobel laureate in economics and has written a book on good economics for harder times, not hard times, but harder times. And she will present parts of that book, but I think she will also want to strike perhaps a bit more hopeful note, arguing that today's pandemic is perhaps also an opportunity for the future. And so we very much look forward to your keynote speech, Esther. And following your keynote speech, we will have a bit of time for discussion, also to get some questions from the audience. And let me apologize again that we are a few minutes late, but thank you for being here with us, and I look forward to your speech.
Thank you very much. Indeed, the book we wrote is actually called Good Economics for Hard Times, but since we wrote it and it got published in the US in November of 2019, 2020 rolled around and the times have become harder. So I've decided to call this talk Good Economics for Harder Time to talk a bit about some of the lessons from this book for the COVID and heightened awareness of racial injustices time. So most issues that are the core issue that we have to deal with today are core economic issue. So people worry about, before when we wrote this book, and what this book is about, covers issues such as Brexit and trade policy and immigration and growth and inequality and social policy and climate change. And since then, we've added at least two major issues in the US. One is, of course, the pandemic and its economic consequences, which we've added in the US and worldwide. And one which is maybe more US specific at the moment, but I don't think it will stay US specific, is the question of racism and discrimination. And of course, all of these issues are issues that economists have written a lot about, continue to write a lot about. They had not written much about COVID, but they now have. But unfortunately, no one really listened to them all that much. So shortly after Brexit, there was a poll by YouGov in the UK about trust that people have for various experts. And you can see that nurses and doctors are at the very top. Politicians are at the very bottom, and just before politicians are economists, who 25% of economists trust economists on economics. And of course, this is not about other issues that they might be talking about. This is about half the rate of trust enjoyed by weather forecasters, to give you a sense of how bad that is. So, not only people do not trust economists, but perhaps as a result, on most core issues, they also disagree very strongly with what most economists believe. So one thing we did in preparation for the book is we run a survey with about 10,000 Americans. So the first thing is we replicated for the US the same type of results that YouGov found in the UK. And in addition, we asked our respondents questions very similar to what are asked routinely to a panel of academic economists in very good institutions by the University of Chicago. And we asked those exact same questions to the public to compare their answers. One of those questions is on globalization, was asked around the time where President Trump was discussing imposing new tariffs on steel and aluminum, and asked whether those experts thought that it was a good idea or not. So I'll tell you in a minute what the experts thought, but we asked exactly that same question to the average respondent, and we found that about a third of people think that imposing new US tariff on steel and aluminum would be good for American well-being. And you might be thinking that I'm now going in the next slide to show you the bar for the experts, but in fact, this is the bar for the experts. Among the people in the panel, no one thought that this was a good idea. And for full disclosure, I'm not part of this panel, but my husband and co-author, Abhijit Banerjee, is, and so he was one of the people who didn't think it was necessarily a good idea. So why this mistrust between the public and economists? And well, maybe there are good reasons. One of the headline that came in the New York Times in, I think, April is this one: economics dominated by white men is roiled by Black Lives Matter. And indeed, economists is a very non-diverse field. Some of the people in this non-diverse field, like, for example, from editors of a Journal of Political Economy, have a strong opinion, which are, let's say, more representative of the status quo than where a lot of the thinking from the public might be. Another thing is that many people think that economists are out there to defend the status quo. And again, still during the racial protests, the Wall Street Journal published an opinion pieces based on economic papers trying to debunk the myth of systematic police racism. So the idea is that, so once again, in a sense, the economists were seen as kind of represented the status quo. And one could say, well, and that's one reason why they are mistrusted. And the reason why they are often seen as representing the status quo with very little critical thinking about whether it's worth it or not is because often they are, because the economists that are seen the most frequently on television are not really professional economists in think tanks or in academia, but rather the chief financial officers of banks, and they represent those interests as opposed to the wider profession. Another reason why people mistrust economists is that they're often in the business of making prediction, and they are terrible at it. And so whenever there is a recession, it's been missed systematically both by the IMF and by professional forecasters, according to an IMF paper. So maybe we could just give up, especially in these times, and say, look, yes, it's, we are not maybe the most relevant. Maybe what we need today are sociologists that can help us understand racial injustice, or historians. We need epidemiologists, we need vaccine scientists, but not really us. But again, we have to go back to the fact that a lot of these issues have a lot of economic content in them, and economics has something to bring to the table. And something that was quite heartening in a way is a huge rush of COVID-19 research as soon as the pandemic started. Everybody went home and started, put them on themselves on their computer and started working like crazy to understand what the pandemic changed about the way we think about economics and how to best understand preventive behavior, the macro of it, the micro of it, etc. There are dozens and dozens of papers on COVID that have already been written. So this is a sign, I think, that there is a desire in the profession to engage in the issues that are the most pressing and relevant for society. There is also, from the Wall Street Journal views, the idea that economists are not critical, they don't believe racism exists, for example. But in fact, for example, take that particular issues where the common view about what economists do is much less rich than what economists actually do. But one thing that economists don't like to do very much is to air our disagreements and complexity in public. So most of these quiet economics that questions assumptions, that really tries to focus on fact, gets a little bit drowned, and we forget about it. So for this reason, we feel that we shouldn't give up, and we should still try to talk on behalf of the profession, and that's what we did in this book. This is not contrary to our previous work. It's not really a book about our own research, but it's a book about how our reading of the best our profession has to say on these core issues that affect us. And what I'm not going to do today is to go, chapter by chapter and tell you what's in the book, but instead I'm going to distill a few lessons and how they're still valid in our harder times. The first one is the question of government legitimacy. So one of the chapters of our book is called legit.gov, and it's about the fact that over the last few decades, maybe starting with the Reagan Revolution and the Thatcher Revolution in the UK, extending with the sort of the anti-European protests and protest votes in Europe, there has been a strong tendency to treat government as a punching bag and to see government as the problems rather than the solution, as Reagan was putting it. So this is an example from the Tea Party proposing to keep the government out of my Medicare, which is the irony of it for those who are not as well versed in the American social insurance system, is that Medicare is the government's program for health insurance for the elderly. I think the COVID crisis has made amply clear when we need governments. Enforcing a mask mandate is asking people to do something they don't want to do, wearing a mask as an externality. So people are going to not do enough of it. And without the government to enforce the mandate, there is not enough mask wearing. We saw it very clearly in the US that if the government is not clear on what the rules are, it just doesn't happen. We also need the government to be prepared. And the government in Europe, in the US, in India, everywhere spends billions of dollars on preparing for vaccines. And nobody but the government can finance an effort like that. Similarly, nobody but the government can finance an effort, a financial effort of the size of the economic rescue package that we're seeing in all of the countries that can afford it. Only a government, and in fact, in Europe, it's pretty much only the community as a whole, the group as a whole, can borrow at essentially zero interest rate to finance the type of economic rescue packages that can prevent turning the necessary temporary halt in activity into a more long-lasting recession. So I think this is going to be a little bit of a make or break moment for governments. And I think also actually a make or break moment for the EU, which is on the one hand, if and when governments succeed, it could be re-boosting their legitimacy and giving citizens more interest in the business of citizenship and the business of democracy, and saying we cannot just not, it's not something we can forget about. It makes a difference who is in office and what they do. On the other hand, in places where governments fail miserably, even if these are places which are ruled by populists and by people who have strong anti-government rhetoric, it's not going to lead to saying, oh, well, we better turn back to more sophisticated technocrat for governments. It could turn into even more distrust and despondency about what government might do. And this is something that worries me for the US, for example. The second lesson, very important for today's time, is the idea that financial incentives are overrated, and in particular, more than ever overrated. So there is a myth which is almost the sort of the cornerstone of most of our social protection system, that giving people too much financial help will make them lazy. And therefore, one should either not do too much of it or make it very unpleasant for people who receive such help, or both. And in fact, most social protection systems suffer from a sort of Victorian hangover. In Victorian times in the UK, of course, they were basically punishing the need for help to make it sufficiently unpleasant that people wouldn't stay there. So this is a myth which is very robust. It turns out that it is not supported by data. And in particular, you can see here from a number of countries in middle and low-income countries, randomized control trials that have given money to people in exchange of taking care of their kids or preventive health, but not in exchange of working. So from the point of view of work, it's unrestricted help. And you can see that the gray bar and the red bar are for people who receive versus not receive the program. And there is simply no difference between their labor supply. So it is simply not true that giving people money makes them lazy in the sense that they refuse to work. And yet, this idea, so there is similar evidence from the US. There is even stronger evidence from the US. In fact, the first ever large randomized control trial was a test of the negative income tax experiment, which not only gave money to people, but taxed it away, making work a financially unattractive proposition. And there found very, very little effect on labor supply. So I think this is something that all economists know, or at least have all economists who study labor economics know. And yet, you can, in the discussion around financial help for people hurt by the lockdown, the financial impact of the lockdown, there has been a lot, it always comes back, like, is it going to make people lazy? If we give them money, are they going to stay home? You can see Chuck Grassley in the US saying that the $600 weekly payment discouraged people from returning to work or taking a new job, delaying the recovery. And there you can see again, the Wall Street Journal, this time not liking what economists have to say. So writing an opinion piece, but not, it's from the editorial page saying economist versus common sense. If you pay people not to work, fewer will work. That's not an hypothesis, that's stated as an evidence, except at Yale it seems. And what they're referring to is a paper that was put out by about 12 Yale professors of economics, very solid labor economists, looking at the empirical impact of the $600 weekly payment, the impact of the $600 weekly payment on labor supply. And what this paper finds is summarized in this graph. You can see the dotted line is the start of those 600 weekly payments, and the red lines are the colored lines are the replacement rates that you're seeing in various states. And you can see that indeed it is the case that in places that have had larger replacement rate, people work less. But that fall happened before the weekly payment were put in place. And you see no difference between the labor supply the weeks before and the weeks after, and then the trend remained completely parallel across all of the states. So what the Yale economists do show pretty convincingly is that, in fact, once more, we see no evidence of the fact that paying people while they are unable to work make them reluctant to go back to work. They are not working because they cannot work. That's why you see a lot of unemployment. And yet the conclusion is not, we should better review our theory. The conclusion is that the facts must be wrong. And so the consequences is summarized in this other headline by Paul Krugman. Trump had one good response to COVID-19. That's the 600 CARES Act. His party killed it. Currently, the aid to the unemployed is gone. It's been gone for a while, and there is no sign that it's going to come back. The third lesson is that the economy is sticky, and probably even stickier today than we think. So what do I mean by that? Well, in many cases in economics model, we assume that when people lose their job, they can either move to another location where there is more activity, or they can change sector and find another job in another sector. So if you're displaced because you were working in a steel mill in the east of France, you can always move to Paris and become a security guard, for example. And it's long been known that the Europeans are not as mobile. So people, French people like their hometown, and they're not, despite the fact that the borders are largely open. People, for example, didn't move from Spain when Spain was hit by awful unemployment. They just stayed where they were. One thing that is less known is that it is true as well in the US. that the rate of geographic mobility in the US has become much lower than it used to be. So you can see a huge decline in mobility between the 80s and today. In the 80s, you have 6.4% moving from, sorry, it's not the 80s, it's 48. There's a typo here, that's what I thought. There's a typo in this slide. Between 1948 and 2016, there is almost a halving in inter-county mobility from state to state, which is precisely all the years where there was, most of these changes happened starting from the 90s, which is precisely when you start to have a lot of geographically differentiated shocks, so where it would have been very beneficial for people to move. The COVID response has been a complete disaster for migrants. Of course, for mobility within the European Union, even within the European Union got completely shut. And even now it's not fully on, as people try to kind of protect themselves from more infected neighbors. But it's been particularly disastrous even for internal migrants in the south. So this photo is from India. When India imposed a lockdown, a lot of people who suddenly found themselves without a place to stay, because their place to stay was also their place of employment, and without any help, because all the help was tied to your community of origin. And so they tried to go back home. And the train stopped, so many tried to go back home by the last train in this like hugely crowded settings, and then by foot, and people got set in, got be kind of placed in camps, and it's been a complete nightmare, which means that even as the economy reopens, people are going to be very, very reluctant to move, which means that something that was already not a very fluid system of people moving about, where opportunities exist, will become even less fluid, both internationally and within nations. The next lesson is more related to what's happening today, that we are seeing is happening in the US, but also in France, which found echo in France, in the heightened sense of racial injustice. So March to June 2020 has been really catastrophic moment, or completely turning point moment for racial justice. Partly because the pandemic is killing white people much more, Black people much more than white people. Overall, the mortality, age-adjusted mortality of Black, Latinx, and Native American is 3 times as high of what it is for non-Latino whites. And of course, there was the death of George Floyd and the racial justice protest that followed. And of course, we are in the middle of a new wave of those. So in the middle of all that, one can become very despondent and feel, well, this is these preferences are very deeply held, and some people are just racist, and there is nothing we can do about it, and they tend to become policemen. And this is something that we want to push against, because one thing that we've learned from psychology and economists over the last few years is that the preferences are not at all stable. There's no such thing as like the deeply held preferences where some people prefer people of their own race or not. Instead, preferences and even the sense of identity is strongly affected by your particular experiences. And there is a very, very stark experiment of that in Switzerland, not on racism, but on the sense of social status. So they invited bankers to the lab, and they asked them to recall either their weekend or success or their last work days. And then after that, they asked them whether they felt that for success, social status is primarily determined by financial success. And those who were asked to recall their financial identity are more likely to think that than those who are in the control group. Then what they did is to ask them to flip a coin many times. And then they were paid as a function of successful coin flips. No one is watching them. So of course they should, they have all of the incentive to cheat. If they don't cheat, they should have about 50% success, not more. And in fact, that's what you find for people who were asked to reminisce about their day. But for people who think that financial success is most important, are much more likely to cheat. So you can see that just changing a tiny thing about the framing of who you think you are affects both your identity and your behavior. And similarly, we are deeply affected by who we encounter, by whether we had chances to collaborate with people who are different. So these are things that can affect our behavior and preferences and on which we can work. The last lesson is the fundamental role of dignity. And this is where maybe the hopeful conclusion comes in. But it starts with something not so hopeful, which is even before the COVID crisis, the US was in the middle of another kind of pandemic, which is a pandemic of despair. This is graphs from Anke and Angus Deaton showing the rise of death coming from suicide, opioid overdose, gunshots, that kind of things, between 2000 and 2014. And what you find is this huge increase in both of these things, in all of these things, everywhere in the US, but particularly in the center of the US. And this meant that before COVID-19, the years 18, 19, 20 were the last year before, after the flu pandemic, that we see an increase in the mortality of middle-aged people and a decrease in life expectancy. And part of the issue is that people feel that they their dignity is attacked by the circumstances in which they live. Partly because of this restricted mobility that we talked about, which means that economic shocks are very strongly held. People feel that they've lost a sense of their social status and they've lost a sense of their professional pride. And our social protection system, as we were discussing before, is not one that gives them back this dignity. It's one that makes you pay for needing to want help. And therefore, it's one that terrifies people in advance of the idea that, oh, I should really resist changes because what would happen if I needed help one day, I would lose all of the self-esteem that I need and social status. So I think a key thing that we need to work on in order to address the issue of racism, in order to address the issue of this mistrust in elites, is the question of dignity in the social protection system and put back dignity at the center of the social protection system. And that's where the pandemic does help, because one of the reason why the social protection system is so not friendly is because even though people feel themselves that they are upstanding citizens, they tend to be very suspicious of the reaction of other people. So in our survey, we asked half of the people randomly selected, suppose there was a universal basic income of $13,000 a year, would you stop working? And you can see that most of them say, no, I would not stop working. Only 12% of people say they would stop working or work less. But the other half of the people, instead we asked them, what do you think other people would do? And there half of the people said that the other people would stop working. Most other people would stop working. So most people think that they themselves, most people have the right perception of themselves. We do know that in reality, people are completely unelastic. Most people think about themselves that they are not responding to either the ability of health insurance or universal basic income, but I think other people are. And that makes them very, very skeptical of increasing the generosity of this program. But what happened with the pandemic is that suddenly everybody needed help. And for a reason that was clearly not of their making. And in Europe in particular, I think the response was fast and the response was very dignity preserving, with the idea of keeping people in their jobs and just paying firms to continue paying them was something that was both at the same time was seamless and therefore efficient, but also dignity preserving. So you didn't have to become unemployed. You just, you stayed in your job. It's not your fault. And many people benefited from that. And I think maybe the hope is that many people would have seen the value of such a protection system, which really plays its role of insurance, which is helping people when they face shocks that are no fault of their own. And so the hope is that this gives us an opportunity and the willingness to rethink our social protection, putting dignity at the center. And if that's the case, then that would definitely be a huge silver lining. Let me stop here and open for questions.
Thank you very much, Esther, for this tour de force and this very, very comprehensive and inspiring speech. I mean, there's many issues to dwell on, and I definitely want to mention also to our online audience that you can please go on Slido and type in the hashtag BAM20, BAM20, and ask your questions. I'd be delighted to ask some of those questions to Esther. But before going to those questions, I think I want to basically dwell on 2 points with you. I mean, the first point is really about the profession, the economics profession that you started off with, and you mentioned the whole story of the editor of the Journal of Political Economy, Harald Uhlig, and his approach, and so on and so forth. So, which was a huge issue, and I guess my question to you is really. And the police and the racism question also, right? And my question, I guess, to you is, to what extent do you see this, let's say, strange kind of developments in economics related to the dominance of theory? I mean, in our profession, I mean. Journal of Political Economy has a tendency to spend a lot of trust and faith, have a lot of trust and faith in theory, in macro theory, in all kinds of theory. Harald Uhlig himself is a macro theory guy. I mean, there are so many people that economists that are raised as economists, being taught models where a little bit of common sense tells you, well, these models are actually very unrealistic. Representative agent, utility is only derived from my own consumption, not from the utility of others, and so on and so forth. And so is it really that these theory people come to shape the economics profession perhaps in the wrong direction, while what you represent and what you also discuss and what you show, I mean, it's a very, I have to say, it's almost not economics. I would say it's social science, and it's empirical social science. I mean, it's basically data-driven empirical social science. So is perhaps the paradigm change that is needed to move away, at least somewhat, from some of our, let's say, very rigorous but very unrealistic models, and towards more of an empirical, micro, data-driven approach?
I think what you're describing used to be true, where not only it was theory-driven, but the theory was pretty, had very simpler assumptions, because that's what we could deal with in a way, and also because that's what, like the Chicago school that was dominant for many years really believed in. But I think the profession has changed. And it has changed in fundamental ways. First, by the fact that it is now, much more empirical. If you think, the fraction of papers that get published in top journals every month, it's now more empirical micro paper of various kinds than theory or macro paper. And those papers have also very strongly been influenced by the credibility revolution in economics, which is that, okay, what is preeminent is the facts. And your establishing the facts should rely on your understanding of the statistics and your construction of careful counterfactual, randomized experiments being an example of that, but just an example. And so I think the acceptance by a large part of the profession that the fact dominate theory every time. And what has happened, I think, to theory as a result of that, including macro theory, is that they have been a little bit forced to write models that are also richer. And we're seeing, the most hardcore of theorists, my colleague, Ivan Werning, for example, writing a very sophisticated macro model that have some of these features in them and explore some of these features. But what has less happened is that has remained very soft, quiet. Is that empirical economists are not the most active on Twitter. And there is a little bit of a diffidence and reluctance to speak out publicly on what we find if it's not, if it doesn't accord to the doxa. So, for example, when David Arthur wrote with his colleagues, wrote the first papers on the showing that the access of China to the WTO and the rise of China as an exporting powerhouse had the consequences of creating a lot of unhappiness and financial unhappiness in the US. There was a lot of pushback, not on saying you're wrong, but on saying, well, but if you start discussing on those results, people are going to think you don't like trade. Like, are you anti-trade? And it's like, no, I'm not anti-trade, but this is a fact that we need to take on board. And so there is a little bit of reluctance of airing our dirty laundry and complexity in public. And as a result, the outward face of the profession is still, to a large extent, slave to economists who mostly are dead many years. And we know, with the exception of the younger people like Harald Ulrich, who are quite active, but still represent a little bit of that same view. But I think that doesn't represent it represents the view that still exists in the profession, don't get me wrong, but that's not, maybe not the majority view on most issues. For example, if you look at the panel run by the University of Chicago, on most issues, you will see this panel of people being quite left compared to the American public. So the economics profession has definitely moved left. But nobody knows it. And you would not know it from listening to them on television. A little bit more on Twitter, which is more diverse, but hardly. So that's kind of why we decided to write this book, to give voice to this, what we think is actually the mainstream.
Okay, so at the end of the day, the problem really is not the profession. The problem is that significant parts of the profession don't speak up enough. Is that a
I think that is correct. That's which maybe is a problem with the profession as well, but it's a different. The research in all of its complexity and richness doesn't make it to the public.
Well, I mean, I can certainly testify that in sort of my area, which is much more sort of macro Eurozone issues, there has been a very fundamental shift in the last 10 years. And I think a younger generation that's much more data-driven, perhaps more left, as you say, has spoken up much, much more. And I think it had a significant impact on the debate, and I think also provided to some extent the intellectual backing and the intellectual background, I would say, for the recent recovery package that the European Union has agreed. I think 10 years ago, the intellectual backing for that wouldn't have been there because many people were much more silent, that were perhaps on that side of the argument and were using much more empirical and new research methodologies. But okay, let me perhaps push you and ask you on my second big question, which is really about the economic system and the structure of our economic system. I mean, I think a lot of the points that you raise here, I mean, you talk about dignity, you talked about mobility of workers, right? I mean, a huge topic where our economic system is still very much centered around the notion that, economic mobility is a good thing, right? I mean, workers' mobility is a good thing because it helps basically smooth out differences in occupation rates across regions, across countries, and so on. But our profession, but also our political economic system has never really talked about, what is the negative side effects of that. What is the negative side effects in terms of social stability, in terms of family stability? We still encourage families to commute thousands of kilometers, literally, because it's economically efficient. But we as a profession, but I think also the economic and political system talks very little about the social, the political, the family consequences of such an approach. And so I'm just wondering if you perhaps want to spend a bit of time talking about the economic paradigm. I mean, the economic paradigm that puts profit maximization still very much at the center of the economic system, and where you see the economic paradigm moving in the macro profession. There has been some attempts to, for example, with the Stiglitz report and the Sarkozy Commission, there have been some attempts to sort of put other measures of well-being up front there so that they become more measurable and more visible and therefore more, let's say, important in the political debate. There's now also debate among let's say, people working more on corporate governance, suggesting, well, we need to include green goals, we need to include social goals in the sort of maximization function of firms. So this is a very active debate, but it's still a debate that I think hasn't fully reached, let's say, the decision-making level. And perhaps you can share just a bit your thinking. I mean, do we need a fundamental paradigm change? Do we just need more pragmatic solutions, such as, a universal basic income and, as you described, transfers to households and furlough schemes? I mean, where do you see this? More pragmatic or more fundamental paradigm change?
Well, I think that there are many topics that your question raises, really several different aspects. The first one is that I think with respect to the mobility, I think economists have just completely forgotten to take the cost of mobility to the worker in consideration in the model. So we kind of assume that people, and it's related to this idea that people are driven by financial incentive primarily. So not only do we put as a normative value that we should maximize profit or we should maximize GDP, but we should also put positively, we tend to posit in our models that people will maximize earnings. And therefore, that they will be willing to move to when there are sufficiently high earnings differences. And so that is something about, I don't think it takes like a fundamental change in the whole paradigm, but including the cost to mobility in our models, pretty essential because it's a huge friction in the response of people. And those costs are, some of them are financial. So for example, there is a huge real estate issue. Some of them are practical, for example, who is going to take care of the children. Some of them are utility, like family, etc. And finally, there are also the social cost of losing your place in a social network. And all of these are just...
and the environmental also, yeah.
Yeah, and also that's from the commuting. And we just forget that, then then we get the wrong answer. And so I think that can be. It doesn't take like a fundamental change in the way we are thinking about how people make the decision, but it requires to incorporate those things in the model. And I think some people are starting to do it, but this has not happened in a very massive way, to my knowledge, at least in macro, etc. And then the second question you were asking is just from a normative point of view. Should we stop maximizing GDP, or should countries stop maximizing GDP? And this is something that we argue very clearly in the book, that in fact the focus on GDP as the main scorecards for the competition between nations has been a disaster. For two reasons. Number one, that's not the only goal. So, for example, the green goals at the level of nations and the level of the world are pretty essential, because soon there will be no GDP to be had if there is no planet to be had. Second, we don't even know how to affect GDP anyways. I mean, what not to do, hyperinflation, to be avoided. But beyond like the very basic getting your fundamental rights, we macroeconomists haven't been able to tell us empirically like a good set of recipe to make your country grow. We do know, we have ideas, theoretical ideas, but in terms, just as a matter of accounting, it's very hard to relate countries' growth performance with a set of policies they have experimented. Countries with very different strategies have grown well, and countries with very similar strategy have had very different growth experiences. So we don't even know how to get there. And so it is clear that it seems really clear that one should focus on other things. I'm personally not a huge fan of trying to aggregate them into some new things that people would then try and chase. But one needs to take into account the planet, one needs to take into account inequality that makes people terribly unhappy, one needs to take into account people's well-being more generally. And if you do that, then it's going to change the policy that you pick at a given point in time. And there again is something that the pandemic might help. I think a lot of people rethought what their priorities were. I think it also made it very clear to governments what they control and what they don't control, and what they need to do to be prepared against what they don't control, to preserve the most important things in people's life, which is to be alive in the first place. And therefore, one might, I think, it might be a moment where this stays with us, both the green imperative and more generally taking into account a richer view of welfare than simply the paycheck or the aggregate paycheck in the form of GDP.
Yes, indeed. I think on this point, I would perhaps compliment you by saying I still think some visible and clearly measurable indicators are going to be helpful for the political discourse. And I think if there's one thing I really think can be easily fixed and improved, especially in the European Union, is that the European Union and the institutions of the European Union do show and do measure some of those things more transparently and in a clearer way, as a way to shape the political debate. And I think during the pandemic, it's actually a missed opportunity. The Commission could have been much more forthcoming, showing much more data as regards health, as regards environmental issues during this pandemic, and become a reference place really for these kind of measures, so as to influence the discourse really. But I would like to ask a few questions from our audience. One of my colleagues, Gregory Kleiss, is asking a question again more on the profession. He is asking, could a bias in favor of counterintuitive results in economic publications explain the problems in the economic professions that you discussed at the beginning?
No, I don't think that there is that bias. Actually, I've been an editor in a journal for now, almost 20 years. at a journal or another. So I've seen very many papers and referees. And I can tell you, our profession is so conservative that if anything, the bias is anything that is new really scares people off. And so it is true that there are some, remarkable papers with remarkable findings that get published from time to time. And those papers might be wrong also, because the reason why the findings were so remarkable is that they were just flukes. And it is true that these papers retain attention precisely because they're more interesting and we all kind of, like to read them. But the vast majority of what gets published in economics is doesn't surprise anybody. And if anything, I think that's the bias we have to go against. We're not conservative in the political sense. We are conservative in the terrified to make mistakes. So in that sense, I see the psychology as much more suffering for that bias. They really like new things. Economists mostly like, to triple check things. And so in referees, it's more what you like to see is so many ways to demonstrate that something that is unexpected is probably wrong.
So I get lots of questions here, so I can't ask them all, but let me still ask one or two if I may. One question is by Elena Flores. She's asking, what would you look at when rethinking social protection in order to put dignity at the center? Can this be done at the national level, or does it need to be a much more global approach?
I think it needs to be done almost at the more local and national level to start with, to develop examples and very concrete ways to do that, and that are successful at doing that. Because since it's not at all the way we've been thinking about social protection till now, there'll be a lot of mistakes made. So I think that the most promising things I have seen in this respect are more like local experiments where some people were very, convinced that this is what one needs to do. So, for example, an experiment that I was part of looks at a program for young people who had dropped out of school and are also not in employment, but were somehow interested in starting a small business. So generally, these people, they go to the unemployment office, and the unemployment office tells them, look, you have no skills. Like, what do you think you're going to start a small business? Instead, why don't you go take this training and become, train to become a plumber, and then we can think about what you're going to do next. And what this organization did instead, in fact, it's a government service, Mission Locale, is to start from the project of those young people, however crazy they might seem a priori, and spend so many time developing the project with them in the same way that you would if you were a venture capitalist, and taking the project super seriously. And at the end of the day, they were not so interested necessarily in starting this project, although some of the project did get started, but they were interested in giving back confidence to this youth that they can have an idea that's actually a sensible one. And from then, this idea, they can move on to something else. And the striking result from this experiment is, first of all, we had a huge effect on mental health. And secondly, the kids were actually more likely to end up in employment, like as in with a wage job, as opposed to either unemployment or self-employed. So they had, at the end of the journey, they probably ended up where it made sense, but not without sacrificing their dignity. And it is a set of kids who were so mistrustful of the institution because they had been so roughed up all their lives that you would think that's this is a hard group of kids to do it with. And this was an amazingly successful program. So it's more like we need to have many of those initiatives that can form then blueprints for national programs and then a global effort. But that's a little bit my bias.
So if you allow me perhaps one last question, Esther, it's by Suman Berry. He's asking you about whether there are significant differences between poor and rich countries in the application of the ideas that you presented today. Is there typically more trust in government in the bigger countries? I mean, that's perhaps one dimension. In the richer countries, that's perhaps one dimension. Another dimension is the issue of financial incentives. When you're very poor, perhaps financial incentives matter much more. I mean, if you can just give us a bit of a sense how much what you presented, which looked very much applying to the United States, also applies to poor developing countries. Suman is currently sitting, I think, in New Delhi, so in India. I mean, if you can just give us a sense from a development perspective.
Yeah, so if you read, I happen to be a development economist, so it's a topic I know well. If you read the book, this is really trying to look at the whole world, and the whole world is too often limited to India and the US and a little bit of France. That would be like the three, our definition of the world, unfortunately. And we are trying to be a little bit wider than that. That was. I think the analysis doesn't, in many cases, the analysis doesn't change, but it gets applied to a different context, so the conclusion might change. For the trust in government, I think it's one where it actually probably doesn't depend on the country's GDP, in the sense that there are places where people have high trust in governments and that are very poor, and there are places where people have low trust of governments that are very rich. Like the champion is probably the US. And then, so if you compare the US versus Denmark, they have very similar GDP per capita and very different trust in their government and institution. And if you compare, Rwanda and Burundi, they are neighboring and they have very different trust in the government. So that, I think, depends more on the history of the country and previous experiences. On the financial incentives, I actually think it doesn't make a difference either, in the sense that, for example, the graph I showed you was actually mostly poor and middle income countries. And if anything, because more people in poor countries are closer to poverty traps, it's in poor countries that you're finding this effect going the other way, where you actually help people financially and they work more instead of working less. So, for example, in 7 very, very poor countries, large transfers were given to very, very poor people. India is one of the countries. And what you find when people get these very large transfers is that they work more as a result of those very large transfers, not less. And there is more evidence from poor countries as well, actually, because there is evidence on the universal basic income for poor countries we don't have in rich countries. And generally, everything points in the direction that, if anything, the effects tend to be positive, which in fact leads us to different conclusions on the validity of poor and rich countries, of the validity of something like the UBI, for example, in poor and rich countries, where in the book we come out in favor of a universal very basic income in the poor countries and not in the rich countries, for a reason we detail in the book, but I have to do with the fact that in very poor countries where food subsistence is at stake, even a very small income can make the difference between a dignified life and not. And that's less true in rich countries, so UBI would need to be much larger.
Well, there's still questions coming in, but I think we have exhausted your time, and you've been very generous. And we started, unfortunately, a little bit late, but we overspent our time budget. So let me really thank you very, very much, Esther Duflo, for this very, very inspiring presentation. I think I speak also on behalf of the audience. Lots of them actually wrote here a very inspiring speech. So this was really great, and thank you for your speech. And this brings me really to the end of Bruegel's Annual Meeting 2020. I would really like to thank all of our speakers. I would like to thank Bruegel staff, our events team, our technicians. I would, of course, especially like all of our audience for watching and engaging with us. And of course, mention that this year's edition was really very strange, very special, because it was all online, with all the good things that go with it, but also with the bad things that go with it. The good things being that we can easily have someone from the US, someone from Singapore, someone from China speaking in the same panel. The bad thing is that I actually, for one, still enjoy very much the bilateral conversation, the coffee, the sharing of ideas in a more informal, personal setting. And I very much hope that this will come back perhaps in a year's time at our next annual meeting. So thank you so much, Esther Duflo. Thank you to all of you. It's been great to have you. And until next time, bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.